Select Committee. Welcome all. Thank you very much. We want to try and start as close to prompt 1 o'clock as we possibly can. If you are a member of the Select Committee and within the sound of my voice, if you could please make your way to the chambers and take your seat. I think we have a couple of folks who are struggling with traffic and parking and so on and so forth. Hard to imagine, but true. All right. Thank you. We're going to wait just one more minute. Hope that folks make their way in. But I want to try and use all the time as effectively as we can and respect people's schedules. All right. Welcome once again. We're going to call to order this working meeting of the Select Committee on South Bay Arrivals. We want to thank our friends here at the City of Palo Alto for hosting us once again, and for those who have asked, and the question does come up, we do have the meeting being taped, so we do have a permanent record of the conversation, and those meetings, once they're available, are being hosted on the websites of our three members of Congress, Congressmember Farr, Congressmember Eshoo, and Congressmember Speer. So if you're dying to watch them again or didn't get a chance to watch them the first time, they should be readily available within a matter of a couple of days. Just takes a little while to get from point A to point B. We are going to be working again today, as we were at our last meeting, with Steve May from the FAA, and Mr. May is going to raise his hand one more time so that everybody can see him. Mr. May is the Senior Advisor in the Office of the Regional Manager for the FAA's Western Pacific region, and I feel sure he knows what that means, even if not all of us do. And we were asked the last time, who are those two nice people sitting next to him providing some technical support, and that would be Mindy Wright, who is the manager of the South Airspace and Procedures team. Thank you very much. And Steve Carnes, the technical advisor to the Operations Support Group. We will introduce, just for the record, the members of the committee who are here. We have Gary Waldeck from Los Altos Hills. We have Mary Lynn Bernald from the Council in Saratoga. We have John Leopold, who is a member of the Santa Cruz County Board of Supervisors and sits as one of our two vice chairs on this body. To my left, Ann Wingert from the Council in Woodside. Did I say Portola? Did I say Woodside rather than Portola Valley? Portola Valley, excuse me. Last time I got the two names confused, so we're gonna have to get me squared away on that. And then next is Mayor from Capitola, Eduardo, and then County Supervisor Bruce McPherson from Santa Cruz County. And then Mr. Moody has his alternate today from East Palo Alto, and that is Madonna Rutherford. Thank you very much for being with us, Ms. Rutherford. Then let me see, do we have any other members who are arriving here on the dais? Yes. And we have Jeff G. from Redwood City, who is an alternate. Jeff, do you know if you're going to be sitting in today for Mr. Pine?
He's right behind.
He's right behind you. All right. And then Mr. Adiego from South San Francisco. And we have Sean Mordeau from Los Altos Council, who is an alternate, who is with us as well. And who else am I missing? Did I miss George? Thank you very much for being here. And geez, George, you have your nameplate there and everything. I should have seen it. George Purnell, thank you very much. And I hope I have now got, oh, and thank you, as a representative from my colleague, Mike Wasserman's office, his staff, Kevin Metzger is here to sit in and listen firsthand. So we're doubly represented from Santa Clara County today. Thank you for being here, Kevin, and thank you to Supervisor Wasserman, who's been engaged on this from day one. And then I've mentioned Mr. Adiego, so I think we now have a full complement. We have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. And hope to have a couple more here at the dais in a minute or two as we begin. We have a tentative agenda, colleagues, that should be before you at your places. And as you will see, the initial conversation it was to respond to a couple of questions that we had at the last meeting one of which was sort of what the estimated timeline for solution implementation would be. We had some brief conversation about that, but there was a desire for a little more clarity about, so if we could get to yes on some things by November, which is our current schedule, what happens then? And the answer, as we were told the last time, was depends a little bit on which set of solutions you're talking about, but we'll ask Mr. May to comment a little bit. And then there was a question as well about recent amendments to existing procedures that we've identified as having taken place in July and September of this year, and we wanted to get a comment on those. Once we get through that, we will then roll into follow-up on the 4 items that we discussed at the last meeting, just to sort of make sure we've covered those, and if there's anything else, or if there's a one more thing moment, this would be the time on those. And then we're going to get to the core of today's conversation, solution groups not yet discussed. Solution group number 2 is the very large discussion about transitioning Surfer back to Big Sur. That is changing one flight procedure back to its old flight procedure. My understanding, Mr. May, is that that's going to have to be a 2-meeting conversation because we have something to report today and some information to share, but we're expecting even more information by the time of our next meeting. Do I have that right?
That is correct.
Okay. And then as to solution group 6, and for those of you who wonder what we're talking about, there were 6 sets of solutions identified by the FAA as being feasible. My understanding is you'd like to make sure that we kick that one to the next meeting so that you're fully prepared for that one. Do I have that right as well?
That is correct.
Okay. And then if there is time, we will get to other solutions as identified by the committee. That is the place where we're looking for potential solutions or helps that we might want to pursue by way of recommendation to the 3 members of Congress that weren't part of the 6 sets identified by the FAA. So let me just ask, as a more formal matter, after I welcome Supervisor Dave Pine to the dais, any additions, corrections, deletions, changes to the agenda, or is everybody good to go today? Nodding and smiling all around. Thank you very much. All right, then let's go to item number 1 on the agenda, FAA response to the Select Committee's questions. First was time frame for solution implementation. Mr. May, what would you like to share with us today?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and committee members, for again allowing me to come and address some of the topics that we have tonight. The first one that we're going to touch on is the estimated timeframes for solution implementation. This was based on conversations we had over the last couple of meetings and some questions that came back to us. So I just wanted to go through those, put those out on a slide. I tried to put those in the context of the feasibility study and 6 solution sets. So as I go through, I'll try and draw the correlation between the solution set and each one of those.
Thank you. And before we go forward, we have the Select Committee's logo up here on our screens here at the dais, but we do not have this information. Let me look to, there you go, a very capable team here at Palo Alto, and I'm noticing that if I adjust it, it's a little more visible. All right, thank you. Please proceed.
Okay, thank you. So the first bullet that we have up there is rulemaking, and as we mentioned last time, the San Francisco Class B modification that is currently underway goes through rulemaking. The estimated 3 years that's up there, that's a estimated amount of time that a typical rulemaking project takes. The San Francisco Class B modification, that number 1 off to the right side, that's the solution set number 1 for Class B modification, and we're about 8 months into that process. So we talked about 18 to 24 months last meeting. We're probably within that right now. But as far as if we were to get into another rulemaking project, initially it's about a 3-year project from the very beginning to the end is what we look at. The next one there is procedure development. This is estimated about 1.5 to 2 years for procedure development. These are when we go through and develop any new procedures like we have been discussing here in this work group. The Surfer is a procedure. So actually our solution group number 2, where we talk about transitioning the Surfer back to some other ground track, that would go through this type of a process. So this would be the 1.5 to 2 year process, approximately. Also, our solution number 4, which was the development of the south transition onto the Knight, that's the development of a new procedure. So it would fall under this category for timeframes. The third one we have listed there are operational items, and these, there's no set time frame for these. It's dependent on whatever the task is at hand, whatever we're looking at changing. It could be something very, very simple and very quick, or it could be something that needs a lot of design, coordination, resources involved in making changes to that. So it just depends on what the task is. But these that are in this category here would not fall under rulemaking. They would not fall under procedural development. A couple of the items that we have in our solution sets are the third one, which is keeping the night flights on the Knight SID until the Knight waypoint, number 3, and number 5, which was keeping the Candle flights on the Candle SID until the Candle waypoint. So we talked about those two. They would fall under this operational category as far as time frames.
Let me go to Mr. Bodorf. Yes?
Quick question.
Please.
Class B airspace would fall under which one of those
So that would be under the very first one, which would be rulemaking.
rulemaking? Thank you.
Other questions before we proceed? Mr.
Yeah,
Waldeck.
Just a quick question. I presume that these are all being done in parallel as opposed to serial. Is that a correct statement?
Well, any project that we start is going to be independent of everything else, so we could have stuff running in parallel, absolutely.
Okay, but I guess what I'm looking for is, do we have to conclude one of these before we can start another phase of the answers you posed?
You mean out of the solution sets? I see those all working independently.
Great, thank you.
Any other questions before we move on to the next slide? All right. We'll welcome Mr. Lane and Mr. Hindi, who are now, I hope, lawfully parked and not at risk of a ticket. Okay. And we'll go back to the FAA. Mr. May?
All right. So I hope we answered the question on the timeframes. If not, we can finish that up. Otherwise, we'll move on to the next item.
Thank you. And let me just, before we do that, on the timeframes for members of the public here who are here, and we want to welcome, by the way, Cynthia Matthews from the council in Santa Cruz County, City of Santa Cruz County. I'm sure some of those timeframes made either members of the public or members of the select committee cringe a little bit. My own view is that when the time comes for the select committee to make recommendations, we, of course, will be exhorting the FAA to move as quickly as they possibly can, consistent with public safety and adequate community input on these next go-around. That being said, I'm anticipating that we will be, in our recommendations to the members of Congress, referencing the desire to see these things happen sooner rather than later. And I think the members of Congress are in a better position than we may be to try and generate a speedier response if that's possible and appropriate. So I just didn't want everybody to think we were sort of quietly saying, yeah, that looks great to us. I think, I could read the body language well enough to know that everybody would like to see things happen more quickly. And I see another one of our alternates, Ms. Lewis, is here from the Atherton Council. Thank you again for joining us. Okay, back to you, Mr. May. Thanks.
Okay, thank you. All right, the next topic is we had some questions regarding some recent and soon-to-be procedure amendments here in the area. So on July 21st was a publication cycle. There were many procedures that were published, and then on September 15th is the next one. There'll be some additional procedures in this area that will be published. So on 721, before I start on 721, let me just make a statement that once we complete a Metroplex, which is our large optimization project that we've done here in Northern California, we're doing these all across the nation. There's about 21 of them nationwide. As soon as we complete a Metroplex like that, we put procedures in. Within 30 to 60 days after we put procedures in, we start going through and looking at those procedures to make sure that those procedures are working right. So, I mean, that's just done post-implementation very quickly. Up to that point, these are all done through flight simulators, and it's all on paper. So now they're in effect, they're working, and we go back through and do a review. So this procedure cycle here really captured all those procedures and made a lot of very minor modifications to those procedures. So if you can go back to that, Steve. Next slide. Right there. So in the Bay Area up here, there were many, many procedures that were modified. Probably in the neighborhood of 40 to 60 procedures that were modified. All right, so we just went through a couple of the procedures that we have been discussing here with the Select Committee and identified what some of the changes were on those. The first one there is the Diamond Star, and there was an amendment to make that Diamond Star be contained within the Class B, Class Bravo airspace. All right. Once the Class B has been amended, we will come back in and change this back to an OPD. So we've actually undone the OPD on the Diamond to get it in containment of the Class B. That was published on 7/21. On the Surfer, there were some editorial notes that were removed from that Surfer per ATC request. And it doesn't really have an effect on the procedure. There are just some small notes on the bottom of it that ATC wanted removed from that procedure. And the 40 to 60 other ones really fall under that last category. There's just a lot of editorial notes that were removed from those procedures. On 9/15, so this is our next publication cycle coming up in
Let me ask that you hold for just a second.
Absolutely.
I see that Supervisor Leopold has a question, and I think he'd like to get it in before we move on to the next item.
Well, I just maybe clarification or request. The Diamond change in path to conform to Class B airspace. Since we on Surfer, it's also outside the Class B airspace. Could we make that change? Because if we see that the step descent is causing some of the noise problems, having as close to OPD as possible to happen, could we do that with a publication like this rather than to provide some more immediate relief than some of the other things we looked at on the previous slide?
And Mr. May, before you respond, if I could just ask Supervisor Leopold and all of us to pull our microphones a little bit closer. I know it sometimes is tough to pull them out of their sockets here, but I'm seeing folks straining to hear in the back. Should follow my own advice. I'm seeing folks straining to hear in the back of the room. Thank you.
So that could be a recommendation from the Select Committee to the FAA. Keep in mind that amendment there has been in process for close to the 18 months. So they started working on that about 18 months ago, and it just now got published. Okay.
Yeah. Well,
So it still had to go through that second.
so it still had to go through that.
It was a procedure development, so it went through that process. Okay.
All right.
All right. Thank you.
Yeah.
Colleagues, anybody else need to go right now, or shall we wait until it gets through the rest of these? We'll hold for a moment. Why don't we let you go ahead and complete, and then we can come back as needed.
Okay. The second bullet there, again, September 15th, that's our next publication cycle. There are several procedures up here in the Bay Area. The procedures are going to be renamed to reflect administrative changes to multiple navigational aids, also called nav aids. So you're familiar with the Woodside VOR. There's 4 other VORs up in the area here, so the procedures that use that, they're being modified to account for nav aid changes. So that's what those are. So that'll be on 9/15.
Anything else before
That's
we
all
go
we
to
have
questions?
for
All
that
right.
right there.
I'm going to go to questions from this end to that, but before I do, I also want to mention I've noticed that we have representatives here from all 3 of our members of Congress, and I wanted to mention that both so that members of the public knew that the congressional offices were fully engaged in participating throughout this entire process, and also because it gives me an opportunity to say thank you to the three offices for their help in organization and logistics. So thank you to all three of the members and their staffs. Starting at this end, questions? Nope. Any other questions on this side? Yes. Ms. Wengert of Portola Valley.
Thank you. Mr. May, just if you could, I think it, certainly from my perspective as I look at those procedural amendments, it's difficult for me to discern what impact it has on any of the discussions we've been having to date. Is it possible to be more specific about both of those, first being Surfer Star and 721, second being the one you referenced that has a Woodside VOR impact? Again, to bring it down to our terminology, what would we expect, or what would one expect to see as a result of those changes?
On the Diamond Star, it was an OPD, so we basically eliminated the OPD, raised it up to Class B containment. Okay, so it raised that up. There could be all kinds of impacts associated with doing that. Using speed brakes. Okay, so there's many different things that could be consequences of doing that. The Surfer, the editorial notes, I'm not aware of anything that would have had any impacts to that procedure in the context of what we're talking about.
Okay. And the third?
The ones on the bottom?
Yes.
Again, nothing, I can't think of any impacts that would be associated with the context of this work group here.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Let me ask if there are no other questions. Excuse me, Mr. Mayor.
Quick question. Just, can you tell me where the Diamond Star waypoint is, where they're coming from?
Okay, so I don't know exactly where the waypoint is, but the Diamond procedure is the one that approaches San Francisco from out on the east. So it comes in way out from the east. If you remember our video, think back to the video, that scope video that we had. We initially showed some tracks coming up from the Surfer, and then at the end we kind of went off to that Diamond procedure where we showed you what happened if an aircraft was coming in too high and they started looping around the top. That's the Diamond procedure.
If it's hard for you to remember, just imagine us, okay?
I understand
Yeah,
that,
so
yeah.
I just want to clarify so we all knew where that point
Okay.
was. Thank you.
Yep.
And then my question has to do with the extent, I think I may have been at least one of the people who raised this issue the last time, and part of the reason for the question was we've gotten some buzz from the community about lowering the altitude at the Menlo waypoint to 4,000 feet from a higher level. So first of all, it's just asked, has that happened recently? Is a function of these two items, either one of these two items?
Not that I'm aware of, no. It's been at the Menlo has been at 4,000 on the Surfer from Surfer 1, yeah.
I think the issue was whether or not, in some cases, it was essentially a directive to be at 4,000, or alternatively, whether previously there was the ability to be at a range between 4,000 and some higher number, which meant by definition that not everybody was all the way down at 4,000, and whether there is now some new directive that forces people to go all the way down to 4,000 and hit 4,000.
Yeah, we'll take another look at that. I understand the question is, people are saying it used to be at or above 4,000. Okay, we look back at Surfer 1, and the Surfer 1 was set at 4,000, not at or above, but at 4,000. So
all right, I'm just going to ask my office to follow up then directly with you on that
Absolutely.
specific question. Any other outstanding issues here on these procedures? All right, then without objection, we'll move on to the next item. And that is item number 2, requests and recommendations to forward to the members of Congress.
Mr. Chair?
Yes.
If I might, there is one
Please, Mr.
question.
Waldeck.
Some of the constituents who have been in contact with the committee and me have noticed in the past several weeks minor changes in the overall airflow traffic. And I'm wondering if you can elaborate if that has been a function of anything the FAA has done or the instructions given to ATC, or is it even real? We're seeing some effect on one day and not another, and I'm trying to get a sense of what's going on behind the scenes that we don't know about.
it's difficult to elaborate on that without having more information. If
I'm sure,
there's
but,
some
yeah.
specific, a flight or a track or a time or an airline or something like that we could go take a look at to see if something changed from previous, that might be doable.
But there's nothing that you're personally aware of.
No?
That was the question.
Okay.
Thank you.
All right, then, thank you. We will move on now to item number 2, which is to follow up on the discussion we had at our last meeting about 4 of the 6 solution sets. And members, I know you all know this, but for some of the members of the public, just so they're clear about what it is we're talking about, we were asked by the members of Congress to look at the solutions or possible solutions that were identified as feasible by the FAA. There ended up being 6 feasible, as determined by the FAA, 6 feasible solution sets. We took a look at 4 of them the last time, had a pretty good discussion, but wanted to sort of bring them back and say, are we good for the moment before we move on to the next one of those, which is a pretty good conversation about Surfer and Big Sur, which was yet another of them. And for members of the public who haven't been here when we've had this conversation before, while there is no opportunity for public comment today, that is because we took 10 hours of testimony at 3 community hearings with 1,400 people and 250 speakers, and we will have an opportunity for public comment when we have a draft report of recommendations to go to the members of Congress. So there will be another opportunity for people to weigh in and say, wait a minute, you didn't include this, or wait a minute, you shouldn't have included that, or wait a minute, you need to tweak this, that, or the other. So just so everybody knows that time is coming. All right? Then, back to item number 2. Colleagues, we had solution groups 1, 3, 4, and 5 last time. Anything new you want to provide, Mr. Mayor, or are you just here on these items to make sure that we've wrapped those up well and truly from the last meeting?
So we do have a couple of points we just want to re-clarify.
Please do.
Reinforce. Starting at the top is dealing with the San Francisco Class B. So once that Class B is amended, more flights can fully execute an OPD. We just want to make sure that that point is understood. And this is expected to alleviate some of the noise due to aircraft leveling off to remaining in the current Class B airspace. Okay? The current and proposed amended Class B contains the Brick Star. There seemed to be a little bit of confusion around that during our last meeting.
And just for clarification, BRICS is a flight procedure for arrivals,
Yes,
but those are arrivals into San Jose, yes?
correct.
Okay, and we've had a little bit of confusion and a little bit of flexibility about the Select Committee on South Bay arrivals. Of necessity, we've had to look at departures as well as arrivals, and from time to time, the World of Oakland Airport and San Jose Airport both interact, and I just wanted to call that out. That's a San Jose operation. Thank you.
Okay. And then that kind of plays into the next bullet, which there are no conflicts between the BRICS and the Surfer procedures. The BRICS was designed to deconflict from the Surfer and vice versa. So they are deconflicted. Currently, right now, they're deconflicted procedures. Vectoring is a tool used to space and sequence aircraft to ensure safe operations. We saw that on the video. So the video of the scope video is what I refer to that as. We tried to demonstrate some of that vectoring. So again, that's a tool that the controllers use for spacing and sequencing of aircraft.
All right. And that completes discussion from your end on the solution groups, yes?
Yes.
Before I go to questions, I know I see a number of folks trying to capture these on their cell phone cameras, which is just great. We had talked previously about trying to make sure that these end up being distributed. My understanding is that the previous ones, the previous overheads, are they now with the members of Congress for display? They are. Some of them, I think, got stuck a little in the process along the way. Do we have a sense for how soon we can get these to the members so that they can have them displayed and the public can have access to them, not to mention the members of the committee? Ballpark?
I'll send it out tomorrow.
Great. Tomorrow is good. Thank you. And again, to members of the public, by agreement with the members of Congress, we, rather than have them be on 12 different websites, we've said, why don't we have all of this information available through the members of Congress to the greatest degree possible. If you can't find something on one member's website, go to another member's website, but between or among those 3 members of Congress, you should be able to find these things, and we'll try and get them there as quickly as possible. Okay? All right, so we were about to go to questions. So we'll start with you, Ms. Bernal, and then we'll go down to Mr. Lane. Council member?
Thank you. We were just, does need to be closer. We were discussing the third item. There are no conflicts between BRICS and SURFR. The BRICS was designed to deconflict from SURFR. If there is a transition to something that appears to resemble Big Sur, will we be discussing BRICS at that point? Will there be any conflicts?
That needs to be part of the discussion. Yeah, whatever procedure gets developed needs to deconflict from BRICS.
So that means that we will be discussing changes in BRICS? Or just changes in
Well,
Big Sur?
the deconfliction needs to be a part of that procedure.
Great, thank you very much for the clarification.
Councilmember Lane.
Thank you. I just wanted, I apologize since I came late. I may have missed some of the time discussion but I wanted to make sure I understood on that first bullet. It refers to once Class B is amended. What is the understanding of when that's happening?
Can we revisit that for a minute, Mr. May?
Sorry,
So-
I missed that.
No worries.
About 18 to 24 months out from
Okay.
that.
Good.
Thank you.
Any other questions on this side of the dais? Or on this? All right, and then I think we're good.
Okay?
And that takes us to solution groups not yet discussed. As I mentioned earlier, the FAA has asked if we could hold on solution group 6 until our next meeting, and has indicated that there will likely be some additional information on solution group 2, which is the possibility of transitioning the SURFR route back to the Big Sur route. But I think that's going to give us plenty to talk about today based on our prior conversations. So, Mr. May, why don't you lead us into that conversation?
All right, thank you. So we're going to start this today. Like Mr. Chairman mentioned, we do have more data. We're putting together some noise data for these procedures. We thought that would be valuable to the committee to look at. We weren't able to get that together today, so that'll be something that we plan on bringing in next time. Steve, if you can go ahead and put those up. So the first thing I want to start off with is just kind of level setting the difference between the procedures, or the difference between the SURFR and the Big Sur ground track, since we're talking about moving the SURFR back to the Big Sur. So what we have here are the ground tracks for each one of those, and the dots that you see on the screen there are fixes or transition points that were on the Big Sur.
It's a little tough to see both for the public who are trying to strain, I can tell, for the screen there, and it's a little tough for us to see on the smaller screen. So we can just give us a moment to take a look at it. And
I'm going to kind of talk through some points there.
okay, there you go. If we can just hold that thought for a moment, let us just take that in. And the MSL is a sea level comparison, and the AGL is the above ground level. Is
That's
that correct?
correct.
Just so everybody, again, is
And
tracking
so
all that.
let me just reiterate those points that you see there. I don't want you to get confused with the waypoints on the SURFR. All right, these points right here were transition points on the Big Sur, and we needed a way to give you some equivalent way of looking at altitudes. So we took those points that were on the Big Sur and just took the latitude of whatever that was and wherever it intersected the SURFR.
And at the, I'm going to call it the northwest most circle, colored circle.
Yeah,
Where am I?
approximately Menlo.
Okay. And so, and on the right-hand side, obviously, we're looking at SURFR, and on the left-hand side, we're looking at Big Sur, and you're showing us the above ground level and above sea level numbers as we go, yes?
At each one of those points, that's correct.
Okay. Anything
Okay.
else you think we should know about those two pictures?
Yeah, so these are the average altitudes
Okay.
over, we took some flight tracks, July of 2014 for the Big Sur, July 2015 for the SURFR, and the average altitudes produce these numbers right here.
All right, let me go to Mr. Leopold and then Mr. Waldeck, and I do want to make sure that everybody feels like they understand what they're looking at before
Okay,
we go on to the
absolutely.
rest of the show. Mr. Leopold.
Just for clarity's sake, these start on land, but would we see a bigger change at a point off land? You know, there used to be a waypoint Boulder
Over
Right.
the bay?
over the bay.
Okay.
So was that higher? And, you know, so it's hard to get a sense of whether the planes are coming in at, you know, at a lower profile.
Sorry to interrupt. We have a profile. I think that might be a little easier to visualize,
Okay.
the profile kind of laying on top of each other.
Okay.
Okay?
I'd appreciate
But let's come back to that if
To be revisited.
if it's unclear.
Mr. Waldeck.
Yeah, Mr. May, I'm just curious, you said these are the average altitudes of the airplanes, and I'm just curious what the lower limits and what the concentration of planes lower than these averages might be.
Yeah,
Or
I
have
don't-
you looked at that?
I don't have the data on for the lower or the upper. Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Any other questions on this size?
Might-
And hang on just a moment. Folks, that's the third cell phone, so by now we should all be mindful of the need to double check our cell phones, committee members included. Down this side, yes. Any questions?
Yeah, since both Surfer and Big Sur arrive at Menlo at the specified same altitude, is there a difference between the two ground tracks in terms of making modifications? I mean, can you raise the altitude of Big Sur or Surfer?
So the Big Sur is a legacy conventional procedure that we wouldn't change, right? We're just using this for comparison. If we build a new procedure, which we'll get to a little bit later in this presentation, it may be over that Big Sur ground track, which is what the desire is here, but it won't be the Big Sur. It'll be a completely different procedure.
Because
Because the Big Sur was a conventional procedure that doesn't use the satellite navigation. And if we develop a new procedure, it's going to use the satellite navigation and all the GPS and then RNAV procedures that go with that procedure.
So therefore, the same criteria doesn't exist for modifying each of them then? I mean, they're different.
They are different, and I just want to clarify, we would not go back and modify the Big Sur procedure. We'll develop a new procedure based on the recommendations of the Select Committee. So maybe the criteria is it needs to be over the Big Sur flight track,
not to
Okay.
but it would,
not to make this more complicated, but I think what you're saying is that for the last 3 months, while we've been having a conversation and the community has been having a conversation about, in the voice of some, just to be clear, can't you just move it back to Big Sur? The answer is yes, we could move it back to Big Sur, but the fact that we have new navigational tools means that we will be redrawing what everyone keeps referring to as Big Sur. Is that a fair restatement?
very fair.
But it could in effect look similar. You would have a different procedure, but it might conform to a similar type flight path. Not exactly the same, be more efficient or whatever it is, but to us lay people, it might look similar.
It might look similar. We would want to achieve an OPD if we build a new procedure.
I
So it could be
support that.
exactly the same, only different. So could we go to Ms. Rutherford and then to Ms. Wengert,
Well,
I think. Thank you.
So when can we know, I mean, what would be the altitudes if that changed? When could we know that? Get a sense of if we wanted to move back and it's not going to be exactly as it was before with Big Sur, if we move back, what the change would be? When can we know that or what it might mean in terms of altitude in particular?
Well, that's something that we need to go through some of the discussions here. I mean, we can show you kind of a range of where that procedure might be, but I think it's really, to optimize it, it's going to be pretty similar to the Surfer for an optimized profile descent. It would be pretty similar to that profile of the Surfer.
I've got a couple of committee members who are teed up, and then I do think it's sounding like if we would let you get to another slide or two, we might have some of these questions answered. So, Ms. Rutherford?
Thank you. I was thinking the question that was asked, and you hit it the nail right on the head when you said that it's just different equipment that will be used. And I was thinking old school, the legacy, and now it's going to be similar, but the technology will be different, updated. So,
Okay. And Ms. Wengert, I think you had questions.
Mr. Mayor, if you could also just identify the other blue dots. I know Menlo is up in our northwest corner. Wouldn't you mind bringing us down from there?
Sure. So actually, that's not Menlo, that's near Menlo.
Near Menlo.
That's near Menlo. The blue dots are the equivalent latitudes of the magenta dots, which were fixes in space, points in space on the Big Sur. That's where the magenta dots came from. We took those dots and used the same exact latitude and just moved it over to where it intersected the SURFR procedure, just so that you had, we wanted to try and compare apples to apples as much as we could to get you that comparison for the altitudes and elevations.
But they're not linked to waypoints specifically or locations?
On the blue ones, absolutely not. Those don't have any correlation to the waypoints on the SURFR.
Even from the old Big Sur? Because they're linked to the magenta positioning. So
Correct.
none of, again, no?
No.
Okay.
Yep.
Thank you.
All right. Mr. Lane, before we proceed?
Yeah, I feel like something so important was said, I just want to make sure I got it right, and heard it right, which was, if we switch the line back to the old line on the ground, but use modern, the new modern techniques of OPD and so forth, that it will be at a similar altitude to what SURFR is now. Is that what you said? Am I saying that correctly?
I said that our desire would be for it to be an OPD, and an OPD on a new route 3 to 4 miles west of the SURFR is probably going to have a very similar profile to the SURFR.
Okay. Thank you.
Mr. Leopold?
And also for clarification, currently the SURFR is not flying OPD. It's close to OPD, but because of the Class B airspace issues, it can't fly a true OPD.
In most cases.
Yeah.
Okay. Let me welcome Councilmember Phil Seth from the City of Palo Alto, who's joined us. Thank you for joining us. And why don't we ask you to go on to the next slide before one of us has another question?
All right. Let me just point out one more point on this one. And
You're at risk, Mr. May.
I know.
Go ahead. Go ahead.
Go ahead. We'll cover it on the next one. But on the bottom there's some yellow text.
Yes.
Maximum terrain elevation along each one of those. So there's a number there. Big Sur is 3,132 feet. The SURFR is 2,574.
And Mr. May, if I can put words in your mouth, and you'll tell me if I can't, that is something you want to make sure we understand, because if we're talking about going back to Big Sur, you want to let us know that ground level is going to be a little higher up in general on that side, and that may be a source of interest to some people in the conversation. Is that a fair addendum to your remarks?
I would say at least at the peak of the mountain, of the hill mountain range.
All right. Next slide. Ready?
Yeah. So here is the profile of those, and these are the same dots that we saw, which were fixes drawn off of the Big Sur route. So you can see these profile should be the same information.
And should I assume that the dot that's furthest away is out over the ocean?
Actually, I don't think it is. If we go back to that other slide, it was just inland a little bit.
Okay, so it's the same.
Yeah, they're the same dots.
Okay, I'm just.
So yeah, that dot on the very right is the dot on the bottom of that other chart.
Okay.
The dot on the left, or the dots on the left, were the top dots on that other chart.
Thank you.
Okay? Any questions on that? Same data, just looking at the profile. Okay. Steve, can you change slides? Thanks. Here is a profile, and this is just looking at the ground elevation. There's really no procedures in here at all, other than the fact that the plane that we've drawn through this mountain range, the top one is the plane underneath the surfer track. The plane.
Hang on just a second. Folks in the back, if we could, gentlemen, it's surprised that the acoustics are surprisingly good, so thank you. Appreciate it. Mr. May, proceed.
The plane underneath the Legacy Big Sur track is the image on the bottom. So again, those numbers that were in the yellow before on that previous slide, that's where those numbers came from, and it's those peaks. So to answer your question, there are some areas that are higher on the Big Sur, but there's also other areas that are lower on the Big Sur. It's just it's a different plane going through the mountain.
And I think elevation's important, but we heard testimony as part of in the public discussion about people who were under the Big Sur track at the top of the mountain who didn't hear the planes, but now under the surfer track, they do hear it. And I think that has to do with the fact that they're leveling off, and that's where we're hearing the noise. So elevation's part of it, but also the descent profile becomes important, right?
Could be, yeah.
Yeah.
Mr. Mayor, you know, the previous slide and this one, if those could be somehow superimposed so you can see where this happens, that would really give us, I think, a little more information than what we have now. I don't know if that's possible or not, but that would sure help. If we could see that in a future date.
Which one? This one here?
This one here, yeah, I'm just thinking if you showed where these elevations were on that previous
So
slide.
yeah, these graphics were pulled out of some system. We don't have a way to go in without just drawing a line on this screen right here, which is probably not going to be very accurate at all.
Okay, all right.
It's
difficult.
They're
I
two
can see
different
this.
computer systems.
I can see a 600 feet difference, but I just don't
Yeah.
see where it impacts. And the other question would be, if it does impact, how much and where, and is it populated or not, things like that.
Okay.
Thank you. Marching on.
All right. Go ahead. So these next series of slides are population densities that we wanted to show underneath both of these flight tracks. So the white is the Legacy Big Sur, yellow is the current surfer. I guess the darker the color, darker meaning getting closer to a burgundy or red, is higher density population, on down to yellow, and then a white color is going to be less densely populated. This is based on 2010 census data, so you can see where both of those flight tracks cross over those population densities. The next slide just kind of gives you a bit more resolution up near the Menlo part of the procedure. And then the next slide gives you
Could you hold on there for just a moment, please?
Okay. The next one gives you more down south, so we can go back and forth on all three of these. Yep, let's go back to the one slide, Steve, right there.
I'm just going to let everybody take a minute who wants to take a minute to look closely at this before it moves on. Somebody help me with the geography here if you can, and that may be a committee member or a member of the public for that matter, but as I'm looking at this one, we have Big Sur is on what I'll call the left, yes?
Correct.
And Surfer is what on the right?
On the right.
And if I look at Big Sur, sort of in the middle of this screen, it goes right over a white area, which is low density, yes?
Correct.
And then what is that white area? Cash, can you help us on this one? That's what I thought, but let me see if we can get some further confirmation of that. Can we tell? All right. And then if we look at Surfer, which is the current operation, you're over a dramatically higher density area there on the right, yes?
Correct.
Okay. Thank you. Folks ready to go to the coastal image here? Why don't we flip to that one?
Okay, let's go next slide. So this is down near Capitola, Santa Cruz area.
Okay. And we have a question from Supervisor Pine.
Is there any way to give us data on kind of the average population density? I mean, some of these tracks are, in some cases, they're, you know, it's hard to compare them in any quantitative way.
Okay, I'm not sure what you mean by average population densities.
But when you look at each track flies over in different geographies, and if we wanted to try to have a cumulative impact of the number of, you know, densely populated areas it flies over, is there some way to make an assessment of that? And any point, like for example, on this slide, we can see the impact in this particular geography. But if you look at it as a whole, you know, is there any way to quantify, you know, how many homes it fly each track goes over?
Since you all like jargon so much, and I mean that with affection and respect, I'm going to introduce a new one called TPA, Total Persons Aggravated. Okay, so we're trying to, I think what Supervisor Pine is trying to determine is, from once we hit the coast to the Menlo waypoint, what's the TPA, the Total Persons Aggravated, and that will vary, to take your point, depending on just how dense the first part is that's represented, and then how dense is the next part, and so on and so forth. So is there some way to sort of ask, to quantify what that looks like?
So I think I understand what you're asking for. TPA is not one of our metrics that we use in our analysis. And I'm not sure there's a way we can do that. So I mean,
could we ask you to give that a little thought between now and the next meeting? Is there a way? I mean, there are numbers in terms of density that are attached to each of these colors. So even if you called that out at the next meeting, that would be a little bit helpful, I think, if we just quantified each of those colors. I know I've seen that, I think, on different slides. Mr. Leopold?
Okay.
Well, just two things I would say is, one is there, in terms of identifying your TPA, you might look to the noise complaints, so that might be one example of TPA. But the other point, and I think what the purpose of our committee is not to have this problem for somebody else, is to have the problem, you know, to have these problems for nobody. And, you know, one of the points that we will be debating up here about this ground track is, did we have problems before? Do we have problems now? Is there a way that we can ameliorate the problems that have been identified? So as interesting as it might be for getting the census tract data or even the population data, I you know, from what the experience that we've heard from the people affected by the change in ground track between Surfer and Big Sur, I wouldn't want that somewhere else. I just don't think it should be going on, because it didn't go on for many, many decades.
Well, let me add a component to this question. I'm going to put my Santa Cruz County colleagues on the spot a little bit, so I want to let them get ready. And to the extent that we have Santa Cruz County alternates here, with the permission of the body, I might like to pull them in a minute if they wish to be pulled in. I represented this part of the coast that we're looking at for 8 years in the California State Senate. So I'm pretty sure that if I look at the Big Sur white line, that's going right through the center of the city of Santa Cruz. Am I correct about that? And I'm pretty sure, as I look over on the right where Surfer is, that I'm going right across Capitola. Am I right about that? Okay. Now, here's what I'm wondering, and I'm wondering if there's an easy answer to this question that I am not able to just pull up, which is we've heard, gee, the old flight path didn't seem to cause any problems or concern, and I'm looking at thinking, really, because it went right across the very highly populated area of Santa Cruz, which is the same color as most of the area here where Surfer's going through. So how come those flight paths went over the highly populated area there that's demonstrated on the map, and it, quote, wasn't a problem then, but it's a problem now? And is it, anybody got a we got some, everybody except the Santa Cruz County people is raising their hands, I notice, on this side at least, yes. So we'll start with Ms. Wengert and then go to Mr. Bodorf from Capitola.
Well, I mean, to your point, Chair, Mr. Chair, I think the thing that was most resonated with me the most out of the statistics, even before we hit population, were the altitude changes. Because you have, on average, the difference, as we saw your two tracks paralleling 700 feet roughly, in differential downward, obviously, lower elevations being flown now. And then when you combine with that the change in topography, you can see in that, just doing the quick math, that was another 560 feet. So now you're closing in on 1,300 feet maximum differential at the coastline. Because if you're coming in at a lower level on the coast, you're able to approach it as much as 1,300. And this is on average. And to Mr. Waldeck's point, I'm sure there are some lower elevations because we've all experienced it in terms of how planes are actually arriving. So when you take that as an average, you still are at 1,200 to 1,300 feet differential as they hit the coast, potentially. And that's a huge difference that I think would have probably the greatest impact on what they're experiencing in Santa Cruz County right now.
Could we go back to that first slide that showed the dots and the elevations? Because there's one.
Right there.
And let's go one more.
Yeah, it's one more where you
There
actually
we
see
are.
the numbers, right.
All right. So the blue dot corresponds to the purple dot. And that's not right on the coast, so that may not be the best comparison.
Yeah, some of them are lower, obviously, but the question really is, how big is that differential?
All right. And part of the reason I'm asking, Ms. Wengert, is that it would strike me, and I may be missing something here again, that when you hit the coast, you are by definition at sea level, and that both Santa Cruz and Capitola would be at sea level at the coast, and so the differential would be there for the lower arrival altitude, but it would not be there, at least at the coast, for topographical adjustments. Mr. Bodorf, Mayor of Capitola, you got some insight you can share on my former constituents?
My colleague, Ms. Wengert, described it very eloquently, and I'm just going to simplify a little bit. They were higher, and because of I'm going to try to put words in Mr. May's mouth, they were the flight path was higher, and the planes were capable. The older planes were able to drop at a steeper angle than the planes today, which is causing part of our problem. But simply, it was higher, and they could drop from a higher descent.
Did I hear that right about the steeper descent part?
Well, the fleet mix from the Big Sur to now really hasn't changed a whole lot. So I'm not sure I would agree with the aircraft having a different performance from then to now. Okay, they're different procedures. They're utilized differently. You got the RNAV component to the Surfer. We looked at the average altitudes. There is a difference in those average altitudes. The topography is going to be different. I'm not sure I agree with the fleet mix, the performance of the aircraft part of it.
And
but at least higher. You can see that they were higher.
The average altitude shows they were higher. Yeah.
And as I look at the two average altitudes that we have here, MSL, 11.3 and 12.3, so that's 1,000 feet at these locations differential. And since they were higher still as they made the approach, because they were farther away from the coast as they approached the coast in Capitola, I guess my question is, so now let's get it out there. How much difference is 1,000 feet in terms of real noise perception?
I don't know.
In Menlo Park, it's a lot.
All right. Well, it looks like I'm prompting some discussion. So let me
In
go
Palo Alto,
to
Menlo.
Mr. Leopold, and then Ms. Bernal, and then down to Mr. Waldeck, and then down to Mr. Lane, I believe.
Chair, you're asking the $64 million question, and it's what folks in Santa Cruz County have been trying to wrestle with for over a year and a half. I think that there's a couple different pieces. One is that the Big Sur ground track was there for 30 years or something like that, and so if you moved if there was noise and you moved to a place where there's noise, you wouldn't complain about the noise. That's what comes with it. So length of time for that track makes a difference. The descent profile, I think, makes a difference, and that's why I asked about the boulder waypoint and the descent of the angle of this. It'll be interesting to look at the angle of descent because at least this layperson trying to understand is under the surfer track, we're seeing the planes have these plateaus which are causing more noise, which didn't happen in the same way under the Big Sur track. Lastly, the size of the cities may also play some role in this, that there's a lot more people in Santa Cruz, thus the ambient noise is different than the Capitola might be slightly sleepier than Santa Cruz, and that could play a role in it. But the descent profile, both in terms of the altitude and the way in which the plane came down, the more I've tried to wrestle with this and talk to people about it, it seems like that has played a big role in this, and also the long-term nature of the flight track played a big role.
Before I go to Ms. Bernal, does the surfer flight path or track involve more vectoring, need to move off of optimized profile descent than Big Sur did?
The Big Sur didn't have an optimized profile descent. That came with the surfer.
But also with the surfer was the inability to conform to the optimized profile descent, yes?
Well, you have the Class B issues that we're working with.
Okay, thank you, that's helpful.
There was part of the Big Sur track, the descent slightly came out of the Class B airspace, very small part. The surfer one comes out more, and which is, I imagine, why the request for changing the Class B airspace is coming now rather than the 30 years ago when it was designed with the Big Sur, because it isn't a violation, I've been told, but just that slight leaving of the Class B airspace was fairly minor as compared to the surfer, which is a little bit more.
Ms. Bernal, thank you for your patience.
Thank you. I spent the last 5 days down in Capitola. Research.
There it is. That's the whistle.
It was tough.
That's
It was
the
really
whistle.
tough. Is that a plane? No. It's around midnight and around 5 o'clock in the afternoon, I would get a series of planes that would come in just about every day. And it appeared to me that what's happening, and I'm going to be actually introducing possibly another item in the mix, is that the planes are coming in, they see landfall, and what I am definitely hearing is the speed brakes going on. I'm wondering if, I'm hoping that the OPD, once we get Class B straightened out, will take care of that. But the other factor is I'm wondering if there are pilots that are trying to make up for time because they have a limited amount of a crew period that they can be working. And they have been speeding across the water and see the landfall and then hit the brakes because that's a way to pick up anything that has slipped out time-wise if they were late getting off or delayed in any other way. First of all, speed brakes is definitely a huge problem that I'm personally experiencing. And secondly, is there another mix in this that we need to be looking at as to pilots trying to make up time?
I'm not aware of the pilots trying to make up time as a contributor to this.
So is that because the FAA is not involved with that, but the industry itself is involved with monitoring how many hours their pilots put in on a schedule?
I'm not prepared to answer that question. I don't know the answer to that.
Okay. So getting back to it, once we amend Class B and return to Big Sur and go towards an optimal descent profile, whatever that looks like, there should be alleviation.
That's the goal, yeah.
Thank you.
Before we go on to Mr. Waldeck, I'm just going to ask the folks from FAA, because I know that at least Mr. Carnes and Ms. Wright, who are here with us, are sort of more directly connected to the operations side with the controllers, if I understand the org chart that I've been looking at lately correctly. If we could get an answer back on the whether or not pilots are or are not in a position of having to speed up to try and make up time or to get to the destination. I just think that would, let's either discover that that's an issue or it's one that we can get off the table at the next meeting, if that's okay. Okay, fair enough. Thank you. Mr. Waldeck?
I noticed that one of the big difference from a year and a half ago to now is the difference in the concentration, if you would, of flights along the route. Previously, we've had, along this nominal BSR route, the lateral distribution of flights that I've seen, the tracks I've seen, were quite wide. And since the imposition of the new system, we're now getting everybody all lined up like in a train. So we have two effects. One, the noise distribution, if you would, for the different airplanes was previously much more widely diverse and dispersed. Now it's virtually all on a track, and now it's also lower. And as a direct result of putting them all in line, they're much more frequent, and the overall effect is magnified by all of these effects. You know, being in line every 90 seconds in some cases and lower. These all have had a pretty dramatic impact on what's going on. And so the question then becomes, over that flight path, do we in fact, are we still above our DNL minimums? And I don't know if we've looked at that or not, but I presume so. And the other piece is there a way to go back and have a more dispersive, laterally dispersed approach mechanism to help spread the wealth, so to speak, to lower the overall impact? The airplanes going over every 90 seconds at a low altitude, in some cases with power on and others not. It has an effect. And can we somehow bring some of these physiological effects, account for them in our plan to go forward? I pose that question to you.
So that's a big question, and I don't have an answer for that.
I'm aware that on the East Coast they are looking at some of these techniques. At least that's what has been reported. I presume that we have the ability to do that out here as well.
So the procedure, when we develop a procedure, the flight management systems, they need a track.
I understand.
Okay, so there's no way to design a procedure that just, just disperses that. It puts it on that track that you define. The other solution to that is developing multiple procedures, and then the question is, how do the flights get distributed amongst those multiple procedures?
I do understand the problem.
So these are.
But the old RNAV procedures were able to offset, as I recall from my piloting days, from a particular track, and I'm curious if we still have that capability in the modern airplanes. I presume so, but I don't know.
Yeah. Not on the RNAV procedures.
Pardon?
Not on the RNAV procedures.
It was something similar is what I'm talking about, but yeah, there was an offset that you could dial in on my airplane and follow it in, as opposed to along that railroad track I could get 10 or 20 or 30 feet or whatever the number was off track.
Mr. Waldeck, I'm going to move us along to Mr. Lane. I am going to ask Mr. May and his team to come back with a little more thinking on that subject for our next meeting as well. It strikes me that we're a little bit off the Surfer versus Big Sur conversation, so I do want to get back to Mr. Lane. But I think that the embedded in the question that it would be helpful to hear a little bit more about the next time perhaps is, we do have folks who say, we're worried that if you get everybody on the track, that means there is this added impact on the track. We have others who say, no, if you could finally get everybody on the track, that would stop the noisy vectoring, which is really the source of our noise. Two different points of view on essentially the same subject. I would appreciate a little technical clarification from your shop if you think you can provide it at the next meeting. Okay.
Let me just add, putting the flights all on one flight track shows a net noise reduction.
Okay. So we're going to ask everybody to hold that. Whoa, folks. Shh. And we were doing so well. we're going to ask you to, I think, having said that, as you could tell from the visceral reaction from the otherwise exemplary crowd of three county residents, that's not the intuitive reaction and experience that many of our constituents have. So if we're going to hear that, and if you want folks to accept that, I think we're going to need some data that makes that case, pretty clearly in a way that we can all understand, which is why I wanted to press the point a little bit before I move on to Mr. Lane, and we look forward to that conversation at our next meeting, okay? Councilmember Lane.
Thank you. I was kind of raised my hand in kind of when you invited Santa Cruz people to conjecture about, well, what do we think it is, what happened there that caused our problem. And I do, I'm happy I could throw my ideas out, but I think, I wonder if folks in the FAA world might, again, recognizing that there probably is no absolute answer, it would be interesting to hear your response, not necessarily right now to that, about, well, what are the factors that you see different, that's different now compared to when the old Big Sur was operating, that would be causing the most noise impact. You obviously had some view about, if everybody stays on the same path, you have some factual basis I know you're going to present to us about how come you know that. Similarly, it seems like you could make an informed statement about, well, among the things that changed when things moved from Big Sur to Surfer, here are the factors that probably cause the most noise below them. And that would, instead of me guessing and others guessing, it would be interesting to hear your thinking on that. And again, I wouldn't expect, maybe you have some answer now, but that might be worth hearing some more about.
All right. Okay. I don't think we're going to go back and look at what, differences between the Big Sur and the Surfer. We're more than willing to look at proposals and where we're going with new procedures and differences from where we're at right now to a new procedure, but going back and trying to analyze impacts from Big Sur to the Surfer, I don't think is part of the scope of this.
Thank you. And Mr. May, I'm just going to say this is my comment, not Mr. May's comment. I think what we just heard was the reminder that there's litigation pending. That's my comment. Coming down this side. Any other questions before we let these folks get back to their slide presentation? Mr. Leopold and then Mr. Adiego.
Just for clarity's sake, there was a question earlier about altitudes and, Surfer versus Big Sur, and if you were going to go back to the Big Sur ground track, that you would be at a similar altitude. There's a difference between the way that Surfer was designed and the way that Surfer is currently being operated because of the Class B, because of it's going out of Class B. Is that accurate?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yes.
And that may be what's causing the noise problems.
Could be a contributor.
Yeah.
Mr. Mayor?
Thank you. I'm stuck and considering your comment about net noise reduction on the tracked approach, but is that simply because of the glide path in the OPD?
Yes.
But then there also is a concentration for those immediately under that OPD.
Correct.
Okay.
Got it. Why don't we let you get back to your slides, and if you want to cycle through them to the point where I asked you to go back, that will allow you to complete the presentation.
All right. Thank you.
So we were looking at this slide, and which is what prompted me to ask about the fact that there were high population densities in as soon as we hit land on both of these flight paths, and that was, I think, where we were, and that spawned this extended conversation. Why don't you pick it up from there, Mr. May?
Okay. We'll move on to the next slide. If there's no questions, we can always come back. So now I want to...
Hang on just a second.
Okay.
Mr. Leopold, I didn't mean to interrupt.
My guess, scanning this crowd, that there's a lot of people who live up in the mountains who are here today, which are not reflected. That we got the one side of the hill and the coastline, but we didn't get the mountain areas. Could we get a picture with the census information that takes us through the mountains as well for our next meeting. I think that would just be helpful to share that information.
Absolutely.
Folks. Okay, and that gives us, from a distance, a look at the whole picture, including the area just referenced. But I do think it'd be helpful to have the finer grained mid-level, and we can do that at a subsequent meeting, or at least make sure that it's folded into the slides
Okay.
when they're made available to the public.
All righty.
Thank you. Okay, so moving forward, here we are.
Okay, so now we're going to draw our focus to the development of a new procedure which the committee would recommend to the FAA. We refer to it as moving the Surfer back to the Big Sur ground track prior to Epic. We've come up with a notional concept name for this procedure called the Davy J. All right, so that's just for conversation's sake. This is notional, conceptual, it's not designed. There's nothing else that goes along with it. This is just a way to refer to this procedure as we're moving forward on what this procedure would look like. The point is, we're not going back to the Big Sur. We're not reutilizing the Big Sur. This is a new procedure. Okay, so this would be called the Davy J Star, for lack of a better term at this point. And our goal would be an OPD of this procedure using the Big Sur ground track, based on what we're talking about right now. That could change, as you guys have discussions. For right now, OPD over the Big Sur ground track. The altitudes of the optimized Davy J Star are higher than the Surfer Star, but lower than the Big Sur Star. They may be higher. If fully optimized, the Davy J will not be contained within the current San Francisco Class B. So if the, let me just...
What is A, what does that mean? And B, why is it important to noise?
If we didn't do anything with the San Francisco Class B right now, let's just say it was staying the same the way it is right now. If we were to develop a fully optimized Davy J, we would still run into those same problems. You'd still come out of that Class B. There'd be those two areas that it would come out. If the OPD of the Davy J Star would be contained, or this would be contained once we go through and optimize or update the Class B. Okay, so once we modify the Class B, then that optimized Davy J would be contained within the Class B. So if we were to move forward on the procedure development of a Davy J, and we're moving forward on the update to the Class B, when they were both done, then you would have an optimized Davy J that's fully contained within Class B airspace. And again, these are all notional, conceptual ideas at this point. So we're just trying to get some discussion going around the development of the procedure. Next slide, Steve. So this is the flight track.
Hang on just a moment. Last slide or this slide, Ms. Bernal? Can we go back to the last slide? Ms. Bernal has a question.
In the way you're working, is there any interim thing that could happen for a year, like raising the elevation so that until the Class B was settled? Are there any things that could be put into place sooner than it would take for the Class B to be rectified?
So
for a higher altitude, so you'd come down?
Anything we do to a procedure, that would be a modification to the procedure. That would be that second bucket in our timeline.
Yeah.
That would be the 1.5 to 2 years as a timeline. I mean,
Thank you.
That's the basic timeline that we use for those procedures. It's not exact, it's an approximate. But it would go through a procedure development. You need to have a published procedure with a new altitude on it when you're done.
So it's not getting the situation fixed any faster than if we go through the Class B situation, amendment of Class B.
The time frames, right now where we're at on the Class B and developing a new procedure, to me, I think are going to end up right about at the same time. The end point of those are pretty close.
Thank you.
Moving forward. Quickly, please, Mr. Waller. I apologize, but I'm mindful of the time.
Do you have an estimate of or data on just how many airplanes actually fly the Surfer route at this point? Do we know that number? I think we do, but I'm not sure.
How many fly it?
Yeah. How many airplanes a month,
We have about 50% utilizing it.
and versus how many might be vectored? I'm looking for that comparison.
Right. So about 50% of them get vectored. So this slide here, on the left is the graphic. The ground track is this would be an overlay of the Big Sur, so what you're seeing there would be the Big Sur ground track. So this would now be the new Davy J following that. We utilize those same, no, these are different. Are these different points here, different from the? Okay, so distances from Menlo. So the thing on the right is the profile. So the thing on the left is looking top down on the procedure. The boxes to the left of that procedure, let me just finish up on that graphic and then I'll come to the right. If you look at that procedure, there's some very small numbers. You may not be able to see them on your screen, but if you just follow it down, you'll see a 1, 2, 3, and 4. Some little white numbers. Off to the left, you got 4 boxes. So those are the altitude and elevation ranges for those corresponding. So the very top box is 1, and then the next one down is 2, 3, and 4.
And is that endpoint near Menlo?
The top, you can see the top is near Menlo, yes.
Okay.
Okay, now off to the right is the profile at the same procedure. So these are the altitude estimates. So this is kind of the range of the Surfer and the Big Sur. Surfer on the low end, Big Sur on the top end. So this is the range of altitudes that this Davy J, this conceptual Davy J might fall under. Along the bottom, the axis there, you have distance from Menlo. So in the black numbers, starts out at 0 on the left, and then 5, 10, 15 on up. And then you have some magenta numbers, 1, 2, and then there's a 3. Those correspond to those dots on the graphic over there on the left. So dot number 1 is about 6.5 miles out from Menlo. Dot 2 looks like about 8 miles out. Dot 3 is 17, 18 miles out. And then dot 4 is about 20, 28 miles out from Menlo.
Does the, on the lower chart, at position number 1 down to 0, does this imply a different, it certainly is a different glide path. The question is, are you going to be applying power and applying more noise in that area?
These are just ranges of altitudes.
No, I understand that, but in order to actually execute it, you have to make flight changes in the attitude of the airplane. So the question is, are we going to be applying power from 0 to 1 to hold that profile, and thus making it noisier?
So this is not a procedure. These are just altitude ranges. So I can't really answer that until we have a procedure to talk about how the aircraft would perform on that procedure. These are altitude ranges.
Would it be your opinion that from 1 down to 0 that they could glide at that level as opposed to requiring additional power to hold the altitude?
I've not looked at that.
Okay.
I don't know.
Thank you.
Yep.
Moving forward.
So this actually concludes the slides that we had for this discussion.
All right. What is it that you're hoping to be able to share with us at our next meeting that we aren't hearing today? Just so we know what is in Chapter 2 of this 2-part saga.
So we do have some noise data that we're looking at. So for the current Surfer, we've done some modeling on that, and the conceptual Davy J, we've done some noise modeling on that. So we can start looking at noise data that we have out of our screening tool.
Okay.
That's
Questions or comments from members of the committee? Let's start with Mr. Leopold.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you for the presentation. just had a couple questions. I was hoping at the beginning of this, we were going to get a little bit further out into the water. And I don't know whether it's possible to get that information, because one of the concerns that I've heard from the public is that both the speed and angle of descent over the water has changed, which has caused some leveling off over land, which has increased the noise levels. And so just getting one more waypoint out would be very helpful in terms of looking at this apples to apples. And if there's a way to do that in time for our next meeting, I'd appreciate that. You think that's possible?
Yeah, we
Okay.
can do that.
The Class B process that you talked about, when my colleague here asked about, could we concerned about trying to find some relief that's more quick than what you laid out in the first slide of today's presentation. I just wanted to ask a question about the difference between rulemaking and policy decisions. You showed that rulemaking is really like a 3-year process or up to a 3-year process, and that we're 8 months in, and so that makes it relatively the same. But what could you just help us understand, is that putting something in the Federal Register and then there's a comment period, or is there an environmental report that has to be done with rulemaking as compared to policy decisions? That would be helpful, because that may impact the time that it takes.
So the rulemaking does have a public comment period. Of course, we talked about last time, there are informational meetings that go out. We collect public comments at that point. There are several Federal Register entries that go in. We take comments back from those. When we publish in the Federal Register, we take comments back from those. There's also a notice of proposed rulemaking before it goes into effect. That goes out. We'll take comments back on that, deliberate on those, and then based on what those are, move forward and then publish again in the Federal Register. So there's quite a bit involved in that.
And that's why it takes as long.
And then there's internal reviews. I mean, it's not just the public part of the Federal Register, but each one of those, there are internal offices within the FAA that look at each, their respective disciplines and the pieces of those, and making decisions based on those and addressing those as that project moves forward.
And in the policy making, excuse me, it doesn't have the same kind of process. That is simply an internal process, or does that also have a comment period and anything else, environmental review?
So
or anything?
I'm not sure how you're connecting policy making to any of our solutions right here.
Well, I mean, and maybe go back to that first slide, because one process seemed to take a lot longer than the other process. And so,
Okay, the procedure development is the second one.
procedure. So I apologize, because
okay.
I just didn't.
Okay.
I'm outside my normal. So it's procedure development.
Procedure, yeah,
I
okay.
apologize for that. So with procedure development, there isn't the same kind of comment period or posting in the Federal Register or anything like that.
There's no Federal Register. Depending on what the procedure is, there's an environmental process that goes along with the procedure.
But not with the rulemaking.
There is an environmental component that goes along with rulemaking as well.
Because the reason I ask is that I'm sure there's a lot more people sensitive to this process this time around than there was last time around. And so I'm looking at, we both share the same interest in wanting to get something that addresses the concerns as best as possible. So, but there could be 6 different people who have different ways in which we think we should do this. So when you have an environmental process and that opens a door, that could lengthen this process quite a bit. And that's why I think That's why I was trying to get a sense as to the elements of that process, to know which is more likely to cross the finish line in the time that you're suggesting, and which might have greater number of hurdles. Because I think that that's important to knowing whether we should be pushing for a procedural piece parallel to the rulemaking piece, or whether we should just count on this really getting to the finish line at the same time. I think that's what's hard, and I don't know the answer, but I just wanted to get clarity about that. I think it also, getting back to the first point, if we have information about those waypoints over the bay,
okay,
it might also help us with the altitude question that people. I can say that as I've talked about this, early on it just seemed altitude's the problem, and then I've learned that that's not exactly the complete problem or the complete solution, and so, but helping get that information out there will be helpful to everybody.
Yep.
Thank you.
Others? Let me start down this side just for a change. Comments or questions? Councilmember Wengert.
Mr. May, thank you. Could you go back to the Davy J last slide, the proposed Davy J with the altitudes?
And just before you do that, Davy J as in Davy Jones' locker? Is that...
You can call it a video.
Yeah, not if I'm going to be at the bottom of the ocean. Thank you very much. Is that
Yes,
where Davy J came
Thanks,
from?
Steve.
Just out of, because I'm sitting here wondering.
You know, I pondered that myself, and I think that came from one of the public suggestions. I think that name was derived from the public. So
All right. Well,
it's conceptual at this point.
So you are listening.
all right. Thank you.
The request I would have on this one is, would it be possible, again, I think this is going to be a way to answer one of the earlier questions about altitudes throughout the area, to add some of the visual, potentially concentric circles around these so that people would have an idea, since Menlo seems to be ground zero, what communities are located where within this potential range. I think it's really superimposing what you've done now with concentric circles over a map that actually would have identified communities and locations.
And the center of the concentric circles are the Menlo, or are you talking about the class?
Since Menlo, no, I'm talking about since Menlo is where you're ending.
Oh, I see, okay.
Yeah, since that's where you've brought it all down, or emanating from Menlo.
Okay.
Just bring it from there.
So like the 5, 10, 15, 20 miles out from
Exactly, as
Menlo?
opposed to graphically. I think that would be a much more useful tool for us and potentially for anybody looking at the graphic.
Okay.
Yeah. Before we
Thank
go
you.
on, let me just take a piece of that comment, if I may, Ms. Wingert, which is, I do find myself often thinking, if I just had Google Maps at the bottom of this picture instead of the very useful but more technical maps that you all have reason to use. So for those of us who are, I understand that for FAA purposes, the artificial political boundaries between and among the communities may be largely irrelevant as you're doing your planning. For those of us who are trying to figure out where does the problem exist, seeing those simple place identifiers, whether they are city limit lines or in the unincorporated area names of well-established communities that may not be incorporated, is helpful. So at some point, just using, what those of us who are old enough to remember AAA map looks like, might actually be pretty helpful. Okay. Anybody else on this side? Mr. Pine, thank you.
So this question goes, my questions, I guess, go beyond the focus on potentially moving the track back to Big Sur while utilizing the next-gen procedures. I mean, I think there's some threshold questions here that we just need to clear up at some point. Like one is, are we really have to have one track? We touched on this earlier. So one option is, and again, some of these things may be far away, but I think it'd be just good to kind of get a common understanding of them. So one is this notion of dispersal. And I read somewhere that there's some work being done on some kind of dispersal software. So maybe this is a ways away, but that, at some point I could just understand like dispersal broadly. And then if dispersal isn't practical anytime soon, and you mentioned to yourself, potentially there could be 3, 4 tracks, and then there'd be some procedure for figuring out when planes go on which track. So, but maybe neither of those things are possible anytime soon. So if that's the case, and we're really talking about one track, do we need to do some kind of assessment, look at possible tracks, right now we have Big Sur, we have Surfer, but, tracks could go anywhere, obviously. I mean, do we, if we're really down to one track, do we need to figure out some way to look at a spectrum of tracks and judge things such as population density, areas of non-residential non-residential areas, areas of special noise sensitivity, location of historic complaints. So obviously my questions are going to kind of a little bigger picture here. I mean, the focus is very narrowly right now on this one potential move, and which may or may not be positive. But I think somewhere in this process we got to bring it up a little bit and say, can we disperse? Yes or no? Can we have multiple tracks? Yes or no? If it's one track, what's the best track? Because right now we have a very narrow focus. And so, again, a little out of the agenda item.
Forgive me, I actually have been having, we've not had a chance to chat about this, but I've been having some of the same thoughts. I'm going to put this in the form of a question for an obvious reason. What happens if you say, you know what, if we're going to go back to a Big Sur-like track, which we're now calling Davy J, what happens if you leave half the traffic where it is on Surfer and move half of it to Big Sur? Depending on who you are and where you are, you may have a, different reaction to that. But, is there a reason that, quote, couldn't be done? Let's start there. Why you couldn't just say, we have X number of planes going over Surfer, can half that number go over the Big Sur revised, or Big Surfer 2.0, or Big Sur 2.0, or Davy J, whatever we call it?
I've not seen that implemented anywhere in the National Airspace System on having two procedures that are close together used for dispersion purposes. I've not seen that used yet.
Okay. And to Supervisor, then let me follow up on the same question, which is there a reason it shouldn't be? I'm understanding that we have to have certain safety distances between planes, and so I'm not suggesting more planes, obviously. I'm just saying, well, if you can already squeeze all of those planes into one track, what happens if you just say 50% of them go back to the old track, more or less?
So the challenge is, when we develop the procedures, we develop them so they're deconflicted. So what that means is that an aircraft can use that procedure, and there's assurance that he's not going to run into anybody else when he's using that procedure. Right? If you have these two tracks that are used simultaneously and there's no procedure on how to use those, then you get into a conflict. What's going to keep those two aircraft from getting to that point where they merge at the same time? What's going to prevent that from happening?
And the answer would be you sequence them just as you currently sequence the planes, but on a different path farther out. I mean,
I hear you, but that's just not the way the airspace is used right now. So then now they're not deconflicted procedures. They're conflicting procedures that are going to require some other mechanism to keep the aircraft separated. So the procedures are now not deconflicted.
I'm going to use layman's jargon, if I may. Right now, we have airplanes that fly over the ocean and that approach land, and they go from what I'm going to call Capitola to Menlo, and they don't bump into each other. So if you had the same number of planes and the same flights, but moved half of them a few miles over to the old Big Sur route, I see no reason why they would have to bump into one another there. If anything, they would be farther away from each other, and there should be less conflict than there was when they're all on a single track. What am I missing?
I don't know.
Okay. Well, I think having that conversation going forward, as Supervisor Pine, I want to go back to where Supervisor Pine, because Supervisor Pine actually had taken the concept farther than I had, which is, and once you get to that conversation, then you get to the conversation about, couldn't you have 4 different paths? And then once you get to that conversation, I think the point is well taken. We've understandably had a lot of conversation over not just the last 3 months, but over the last year and a half now about, for God's sakes, in the view of some, can't you just put it back where it was? That didn't seem to be a problem. But if you're going to have that conversation, more to the point, colleagues, if we're going to have that conversation, I think Supervisor Pine's point is well made, which is why assume that the place that it used to be is the best place for it to go back to? We need to ask ourselves an important question with help from our friends at the FAA, which is, if you're going to move it somewhere else, is the old location the best somewhere else to move it back to, quote unquote? I think that's it. Right. So Supervisor Pine, frankly, had taken the conversation farther in his own mind than I had in mind, but I think it's very relevant to the Surfer Big Sur conversation that we're in the midst of, and I'm glad we're going to keep having the conversation a couple weeks farther. Going down this way, Supervisor Leopold?
Well, just my colleague from Portola Valley had a good suggestion, and I think about trying to get a better idea of what these points are on this chart. I'm wondering if you could also give us the Class B airspace, what this would look like in the current Class B airspace, and what it would look like in the changes that you're making in the Class B airspace, so we could get some sense. That we have that information about Surfer, and it would be good to know, and that would, if that procedure got there before the Class B airspace changes, we would know what we were getting into.
Okay. So just so you know, remember we have kind of a top end and a low end altitude, so that would be the level of detail that we would show if we were trying to show penetrations in Class B. It would be that range, right? It's not going to be a line because we don't know what that is yet for that procedure. So it would be based on this range right here.
But one would assume, right, that that you're going to work to achieve OPD, right?
That's the desire.
So
yeah.
I mean,
Yeah.
they would.
So conceptually, what
there might
we're
be a
saying-
window at different waypoints, but it's you generally have a sense.
Yeah.
I don't think it would be useful. For us.
No, I understand.
Colleagues, this is a conversation I think we need to keep having, even if it's not always as focused as we might hope, because I think we're spinning out different possibilities here, and I think that's useful. That being said, we've been at it for an hour and 45 minutes, more or less, without a break, so I'm going to suggest that even though we're sort of mid-conversation, that I see 2:43. I'm going to ask that we reconvene in 7 minutes, which will make it 10 minutes before 3. And as I said last time, that's a real 7 minutes, not a pretend 7 minutes. Thank you. We'll see you in 7 minutes. Come back to the chambers, and my apologies, I've got us a full 2 minutes late here, so
I heard you were clapping when you came back.
that's it. And again, if the committee members could retake their seats, and if members of the public could be seated, please. All right. We've got, we're in the middle of the conversation under 2BI, Solution Group 2, transition the Surfer Star back to the BSR ground track prior to Epic. We had some questions and comments coming this way. I think we had completed comments and questions, at least for the moment, from Supervisor Leopold. And so let me look to Ms. Bernald, Mr. Adiego, Mr. Waldeck, Mr. Hindi, Mr. Lane. Council member?
Thanks. I'm glad we have this particular slide up. I know others have, I just want to put my 2 cents in about another image associated with this that might be useful for us, which would be to put this with Surfer. You know, how does Surfer look in relation to this in terms of what it's, you know, how it's performing now, and see what that difference is, because that is really the essence of what we're talking about. This is the possible new look, and I'd like to see how that compares to the current look.
Say again. Forgive me, but
oh, just I'm wondering if at another time there could possibly just be an image, this image with a superimposing of how you would draw a similar image of the Surfer.
got it. Mr. May?
So we'll take that into consideration and see if we can add that on.
Thanks.
Yeah.
All right. Other comments or questions on this? Mr. Bodorf, Mr. Mayor.
I know what you've given us is just estimates of altitudes, but at some point, Davy J will have to take a ground track. And I'm just wondering how that evolves where a ground track is decided.
So we're waiting for the committee's recommendation on where that ground track's going to be, or where that proposed ground track would be.
So it would be up to us to propose where that ground track would exist,
Yes.
and then you would implement. I got OPD and raised Class B, the things that you would like to try to incorporate into that.
Right.
The suggestion, the ask would come from us.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Other comments or questions on this issue? Mr. Leopold.
We've got a lot of testimony from the public about raising some of the altitudes at the waypoints. In the consideration of the development of Davy J, can we make recommendations for you that the Menlo waypoint be raised and therefore design Davy J at that slightly higher altitude?
So, you know, I don't mean to be sarcastic. The committee can recommend what the committee wishes to recommend. And I'm serious, I'm not being sarcastic. So I don't want to tell you, no, you can't recommend anything. You can recommend anything. We've talked about the Menlo waypoint and raising that altitude and some of the constraints we have around raising the altitude at that Menlo waypoint.
Mr. Leopold, if I can chime in on this point, two observations. One, I don't want to revisit at length because we've already had the conversation, but there's a sort of a back and forth about to what extent are we going to attempt as a committee to actually design as opposed to simply recommend, here's what we'd like to see, and ask the FAA to figure out how to design it. That's a piece of the, you know, where do we go from here question, it seems to me. The second piece is, and I've been just struggling with this as an individual committee member, and again, with all due respect to all the different points of view that have been shared, at some point we're going to be asked to make a set of recommendations, and I guess my view is if the FAA can make the case that something really is impracticable, not doable, you know, defies the laws of physics, then I'm probably not inclined to make the recommendation just, you know, to feel good, because we're trying to be practical here about what it is we can get accomplished, and we want to see some real change that improves the situation. That being said, if the pushback from the FAA is, gee, that would be hard, or gee, I'm not sure we've done that before, or, you know, gee, we'd have to sort some stuff out, well, then I'm going to be open to saying, let's give it a try and make the recommendation. The fact that our chances are, quote, only 50-50 by virtue of the real dynamics that the committee is faced with and that the FAA is faced with wouldn't preclude me, I think, from wanting to vote for a recommendation. And I think each of us will sort of be in our own place on that, and that's as it should be with 12 different committee members. Somebody might say, you know, I don't care how many different ways they tell me it can't be done. I think it can be done, and I want to vote to recommend it. Okay, I'm sort of more of a middler or a tweener, I guess, in that, as I say, the fact that something is hard or hasn't been done before, to me, doesn't mean it can't be done or shouldn't be done. So I think, you know, we'll have to sort those out on a case-by-case basis as we go. Mike.
Let me add that I don't necessarily disagree with any of that. And the one thing that I've heard fairly consistently at our meetings and also from the people in Santa Cruz County is bring us some relief. And when I start hearing about procedures that haven't been done anywhere else in the country, I think, well, what are we looking at, 3, 5? You know, I don't know how many years that is until we get those done. So, you know, they don't need to be mutually exclusive. What can we do in the short term, and then what do we look long term about some other things? I just want to just state maybe the obvious is that the impact of the current flight pattern is real. It's oppressive, and people are in great need of relief. And so trying to find something that we can do to relieve that is very important, I think, to all of us. And to be creative and break new ground, I'm all for that too. But I want to find that relief as quickly as possible.
All right. We have 2 other items on the agenda today. The other is other solutions as identified by the committee. That was on our agenda the last time. And then we have longer term issues. And we've had this conversation, colleagues, about sort of the 6 buckets of feasible items and other issues as identified by the committee where we think we can make some progress. And then longer term issues, and it sort of segues nicely with the comments that you just made, I think, Supervisor Leopold, which is we have gotten through what we can get through today, I gather, with the FAA on Big Sur Surfer, yes?
Correct.
Okay. So then in the roughly hour we have left before we try and wrap things at 4, we can revisit other solutions as identified by the committee. And I don't believe we started to take up longer term issues at the last time. And again, you know, everybody's view of longer term, shorter term, immediate, just different. One of the reasons I wanted to get the information out there about how long things take earlier today was because, as I said, we are going to, I think, need to ask our congressional representatives to work with the FAA to move the agenda sooner rather than later to the greatest degree possible. But are there other solutions as identified by the committee that didn't get raised at the last meeting that someone has since said, you know, I'd like to add this to the list? And if so, now is the time. So, Mr. Hindi.
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
And Mr. Hindi, I think if you can pull that a little closer, thanks.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Chair. This is something I have raised yesterday at the San Francisco Roundtable, and I would like to talk to the FAA about. I would like to see if the FAA could add a directive that unless SFO is landing 2 airplanes concurrently on runway 28, that only runway 28 right to be used.
Mr. Hindi, would you just say that again, please?
Sure. I'm asking the FAA to issue a directive unless SFO is landing 2 airplanes concurrently, that only 28 right to be used, not 28 left, thus moving
right,
the airplanes closer to the bay rather than over Foster City.
All right.
I'm also working on another solution, but I probably would raise it in the next meeting if that's okay with the chair.
Fine. If you want to take time to sort it out a little bit more?
Exactly.
I got it. Good.
Thank you.
Anything else under this set of categories? We had a lot of them. My staff tells me that once the list was typed, that it was a long list after our last meeting. So, Mr. Leopold, others?
I have some technical pieces, and I'm happy to share it, but I'll give you the general look at it is routing the SFO southbound departures offshore, and there's some suggestions that have been made to make them less impactful. And I'd be happy to share this with the whole group, but it's fairly technical, and I could share it with you today. I think it would be helpful in terms of there's less crossing over the surfer route, or it's surfer at a lower level, and if we can keep it offshore a little bit longer, it might make some sense about 4 or 5 miles down into the ocean. We talked about this last time, but modifying the BRICS procedure to San Jose Airport. The changes that have been made to Surfer and then therefore to BRICS have exacerbated problems around noise, and so there are some technical suggestions about ways in which we could modify that procedure in the hopes that it would relieve some of the noise, and I'd like you to at least take a look at those. The last one is moving a waypoint on the first leg of Surfer, which is I think it's pronounced Nurli, N-R-R-L-I. Is that how it?
Gnarly?
Gnarly. Wow, I don't even have a teenage son. To move that waypoint because one of the communities affected, which is not even represented up here, is the Carmel Valley, and that waypoint has some impact on those folks. So they've approached us to at least bring this up as part of this discussion, and I'll get you the information about that. Okay. Thank you.
All right. Mr. Waldeck.
Mr. May, you've been really, really helpful today. I just wanted to restate something that I learned here recently. In Charlotte, let me see here, Charlotte Douglas International Airport, I'm going to read this from a note I got. The new system that we're trying to use puts everything on basically a long train track. And the city of Charlotte asked FAA to send their departures on different paths, and I'm presuming the approaches on different paths as well, to help maybe expose more people to the noise, but the overall impact because of repeated noise would be significantly reduced. Mr. Dennis Roberts, the regional FAA administrator there, has indicated they plan to look into that with some positive response. And I asked you that question earlier today, and I got more or less, no, we can't do that, but I'd sure like to see that concept be reevaluated to help spread the wealth, if you would. But we have some people here who are in, whether they bought it or not, noise corridors that are just driving them crazy. And that's a part of the reason why we're all here, is to let's moderate that if we can. If, higher altitudes, more use of the bay, whatever. I'm not in favor of moving noise at all, but I think that having moved it onto a group of people without even a may I please type response, I think that was just more egregiously a poor decision. So if that could be done, look at it at dispersing angles coming in, offset vectors, whatever it turns out to be off these approach routes as well as departure routes. This could be a significant improvement in terms of our overall health and welfare here.
All right. Anybody else? Ms. Bernald. Council member?
I'd also like to add to the list, as soon as you're finished writing. It's okay. Keep going. Oh, he's good. There was a lot. To consider reversing the U-turn on San Jose arrivals on reverse flow days. There's some impact over Sunnyvale, and I think that could be alleviated. And again, I can get you the material on that.
And you said reversing the U-turn?
Currently on reverse flow days, traffic arrives to the left of San Jose and descends to about 2,000 feet over Sunnyvale.
Okay.
And crosses over the shoreline and does a right-hand turn, U-turn for the final approach. It has a high impact on the flight patterns for Sunnyvale.
Right.
On reverse flow days, though, the loop departure procedure is not used. Therefore, the noise abatement ground track that was used for loop possibly might be available for arrivals.
Okay, so you're saying use the loop
Use the loop.
departure.
Loop departure procedure is not used on reverse flow days.
Okay.
So can the noise abatement ground track that was used for loop be available for arrivals? Or is that just too caught up with another track that we haven't looked at?
Yeah, we'll look into that. I'm not sure I understand that
If it's possible,
myself.
I'll give you the information. My concern, of course, is whether it impacts Moffett. I don't know what was going on in Moffett yesterday, but I know at least more than a dozen, maybe 24 planes came in. But I'd like to be able to give some relief to Sunnyvale, too, who is impacted by this loop.
Okay.
Mayor Diego.
Chair Subcommittee, and I know that the world is much larger than SFO, and they're all interrelated, but I think our charge was SFO.
Yes, but you will recall there's sort of a couple of areas where we've had, my view, we sort of had to come to grips with the fact that not everything is as narrowly constrained as our initial charge, as much as I have been a voice trying to keep us focused on our initial charge. We were asked about we were asked by the members of Congress to look at the feasible items identified by the FAA, but I think as a committee we agreed that we needed to look beyond the tight boundaries of whatever they had designed. So we've added some other items there. We are called the Select Committee on South Bay Arrivals, but we've been talking about departures as well, and I think most of us have concluded that that's a necessary part of the conversation. I shouldn't speak for others, at least that's what I've concluded. And then I specifically asked, as you may or may not recall, at that very first meeting at SFO when we were all impaneled, are we really staying at SFO in this conversation? And the response we got that day was sort of yes, but the airspace clearly interacts with what happens at Oakland and at San Jose, so you're going to have to talk about those places as a matter of necessity when you're talking about SFO. So from the beginning, I've been, again, my personal view, I've been sort of focusing on, this looks daunting enough without adding more to the to-do list. On the other hand, we talked about the other practicable solutions that we didn't want to let go by. And we also talked about mentioning longer-term issues, and we're going to get to those in a minute, that we're not going to solve between now and November 17th, but that we want to make sure don't get forgotten. And that's, so there's been a little wiggle on all of those things. And I think that's understandable.
Sure. Thank you for the reflection.
That's my view. Somebody else could have a sort of a totally different take on it, but that's sort of how I have seen things evolve over the last 3 months. Other things in this category of other solutions as identified by the committee? Looking down this way? Nope. Then,
I'm sorry, I was waiting for them.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. My apologies.
Waiting for them to chime in first. A couple quick questions or recommendations. One is I want to know if it's possible, this is in relation to oceanic arrivals, if it's possible to use a virtual fan-in method for dispersing those planes. That's one.
Mr. Broderick, are you, just so I understand the question, are you talking about what some people have referred to as the sort of the herringbone pattern of having folks arrive on the flight track at different points along the way?
It's a method where they're dispersed out farther into the Pacific, and then they're still going to a line on the Menlo Waypoint when they make the turn, but it's a dispersion that will reduce the impact on Palo Alto.
Mr. May, do you think you understand what the question is? Because I want to make sure we get the question clear.
Well, I think I understand it, but I think dispersion out that far isn't going to have any effect in the Palo Alto area.
Well, I'm trying to distinguish between dispersion and sequencing. Sequencing, in my use of the term colloquially, is just, do we need more distance between each of these planes so that they're not all stacked up over the peninsula and the Santa Cruz coast and the summit as they arrive here in California? And that's a different question than if we have a track, does everybody enter the track out here and stay on the track, or do folks come into the track at different points so that at least early on they're not all on the same track? And while that doesn't provide much relief at the end, meaning Menlo, it might provide some relief earlier on. And Mr. Rutherford, am I even?
No, you're close. I'll use the point. I know these waypoints I may say right, but the point out in the Pacific is Pirat. Is that correct?
Say it again?
Pirat, P-I-R-A-T.
Pirate.
I'm not familiar with that.
Pirate. Okay, so Pirate is where they're aligning now, and then they are on a single track coming all the way in. The dispersion would allow them to disperse farther out so that, yeah, they would all be at the same at Menlo, but prior to that, it wouldn't be concentrated on one flight path. That's the suggestion. Virtual fan-in method.
I think this, I don't want to tell Mr. Botter what his question or suggestion is, but I do think this is what many people have been calling the herringbone approach, but maybe not. So let's explore it a little bit further and make sure that the question is properly understood and that I don't mush it together with another one that it doesn't belong to.
That's it. But I believe it could be the same thing. Again,
we'll
I'm just not
see.
familiar with the herringbone approach, but it seems like it's similar. And the other one is just a question with the surfer arrival, just possible if it's able to have smaller and more numerous control windows on the altitude for the surfer arrival.
So you're talking about on the Davy J. Could the Davy J have?
Correct. Well, that would be the next step. I'm aligning it with the existing surfer, but in a new Davy J, would it be possible to establish those windows? That would be more accurate. Thank you.
Let me say it would be possible, but I mean that has to go through the engineering, safety analysis, everything else that goes along with developing a procedure.
Okay.
So your question is looking at the windows on those waypoints.
Correct. Possible.
Okay. Others? We do have longer term issues to flesh out real quickly here as well. Then, before I run up and down the column, I'm just going to toss out three real quickly on the longer term issues. We've had a recurring conversation here about how noise is measured or not. I don't think we're going to, as I've said before, I don't think we're going to come to any conclusions, let alone change the FAA's noise measurement protocols between now and November the 17th. That being said, I think this is a critical part of the conversation. I think it needs to be part of a longer term conversation. So I'm going to toss that one into the longer term mix for discussion by our committee, possible recommendation if there's a consensus, which is defined as 8 with 1 from each of the 3 counties on the item, and ask the FAA to be giving that some thought in terms of where we might go longer term. That raises then the obvious question, which is, gee, I wonder what forum we might be able to have that conversation in, particularly if this select committee finishes its work as scheduled before the end of this year. And we've had some conversation here about the need for a longer term venue to make sure that there's follow-up on whatever recommendations this group makes, but also so that in a year from now, 3 years from now, and 5 years from now, we aren't looking at a room full of distraught citizens who say we got a problem and no place to take it. So the notion of sort of what kind of a venue, does it have a relationship with the SFO roundtable? Is it an entirely separate? I don't have a conclusion about that, but I think we would. I think we're going to need to wrestle that at least somewhat to the ground between now and the end of this. And then the last one that I will put in this category, because I don't think it's a short or medium term, maybe it is, I think it was Councilmember G, who I think I can see over the, there he is, over the top of the computers, asked a couple of to me, intriguing questions about military airspace and the extent to which military airspace constrains your ability at the FAA to be a little more creative in terms of civilian airspace and how it is used and how we can make these accommodations. I feel pretty sure that the military is not going to be moving any faster than you all are at the FAA. If anything, you know, there are a whole host of reasons why that can sometimes be a more challenging conversation, but I don't want it to get lost. So I do think that that might be part of the longer term list of things that we take a look at. So those are, I would call them my three to seed the conversation. They are by no means my three. They've come from different members of the community and from members of this panel, but those are three that are on sort of my list of things that I think we don't want to forget, even as we say they're not within our purview here in the next couple of months. One other thing I want to mention before I go to colleagues to add on to this is I have been approached or gotten one member of our band of alternates has asked if there's a way for the alternates to sort of weigh in some more formal way before we wrap this process up. I think that is appropriate, if only because it falls in the category of the least we can do for the folks who stand and wait for one of us to get hit by a truck and miss a meeting, I guess. But I am thinking that at some point we might want to simply schedule at a meeting 3 or 4 minutes for each alternate if they choose to use it, to simply walk up to the microphone and say, you know, have enjoyed participating from time to time, have enjoyed listening through all of this. Here are some things I want to make sure that the voting members get to or are mindful of when the time comes. I'm not going to ask for a formal vote on this. I just wanted to surface it. Do I see nodding heads, or do you all want to shake your heads publicly and say, no, you don't want to let those nice people who are working so hard get 3 or 4 minutes at the microphone? All right, we'll find a way to work that out. All right, longer term issues. Others. Let's start down at this end. Supervisor.
Well, yeah, I just, maybe this is not longer term, but we've been talking a lot about the implications of a brand new procedure for Big Sur ground track. Should we be talking also about adjustments to the current SURFR procedure, especially regarding altitude? It's one of what I guess Anna Eshoo said, can't we tweak this to make it better sooner? I think I'd like to have us concentrate a little more on that. You know, I mean, I understand this is the procedure that it takes a long time, 1.5 years or 3 years or whatever, but I just would like to see if we can address it a little earlier to make some kind of an adjustment so we can ease the pain for those that are under SURFR or right now.
If I can expand on that a little bit, Supervisor, I think whether it is the 6 buckets of feasible items or the other solutions as identified by the committee, given the fact that all of these involve a reasonably long time frame in terms of immediate relief potential, I think we should just ask the FAA to identify or highlight in both of those categories areas where they think there is the opportunity for more immediate relief administratively without the procedures. And I don't know yet whether that'll be a small number or a medium number or a large number, but I do think we need to sort of look at everything in that bucket of 6, or those 6 buckets, and everything in the other solutions as identified by the committee through the lens of, okay, what can we do sooner rather than later, which is what I hear you asking for.
That's right. I mean, yeah, it's frustrating for everybody. It's depressing for many about how long this is going to take one way or the other, but if we can do anything, you know, that just to make it somewhat better in the interim, that'd be great.
All right. And I'm going to look to Mr. May and say, Mr. May, was that duly noted?
Duly noted.
Thank you. Okay. Others under longer-term solutions, if any? Supervisor Pine.
Two items, and I apologize if they've been brought up in the past. I've had to miss a meeting or two. One is the future use of this time-based flow management approach. And I think it, as I understand it, that will go a long way to reduce vectoring. And, where are we and what should our expectations be for time-based management or time-based flow management to be implemented? Because as I understand it, that's going to be a very effective tool. But I don't have a good grip on when we can expect to see it.
So it is, there are some timeframes associated with that. That's a national program. That's a topic that we plan on discussing under solution group number 6.
Okay, we can come back to that.
Yeah.
And then the other issue which has come up from time to time is, when new procedures are implemented or changes are implemented of any kind, how do we kind of measure their effectiveness? In other words, some kind of ground-based monitoring. And is that something the FAA is willing to do, or is that something we need to look to SFO to do? Because we do need to measure whether the changes are effective beyond anecdotal responses. And we need to kind of figure out a process for that. And how can the FAA help or not help with that?
So I think, just listening to you, you need to define what effective is. What effective for you might be different than what's effective for us.
Of course, I was
on those
referring
procedures.
to noise.
We have had some conversation, we've had a lot of conversation at a number of different meetings that have dealt with this issue in some way, shape, or form. I share Supervisor Pine's view. I take your point, which is that we need to figure out what it is we're asking you to do. But here's what I'm going to say, both in fairness to the FAA, a phrase that I know you're happy to hear me use, and more important, in fairness to the community. Going through all this should produce a discernible benefit.
Right.
I think everybody wants that. And what we don't want to do is have you take a lot of steps that you feel have actually fixed the problem or mitigated the problem, only to then be confronted by folks who say, no, here we are all these months later, and it's not any better than it was. So it would be, I think, important to have a objective measure of noise on the ground before and after. And figuring out what that is something that I think is sort of a process question that is overarching, again, sort of in the same way that Supervisor McPherson's point was overarching. It may not be a, quote, one of the 6 items in the feasible buckets, may not be other solutions as identified, but from a process standpoint, let's ask what can we do sooner rather than later.
Right.
And let's also ask, how can we measure this before you take action to make sure that there is proof positive that it had the desired result after the fact? Because you don't want to be back here with a new group of 12 next year having the same conversation, and certainly the community doesn't want to be waiting and back for the same conversation. So we can work that through with you in the next couple of months, but I think what I'm going to do is sort of create a new virtual category here, which is process issues that we want to identify that are overarching for all of these, if that makes sense. And as I say, some of the noise measurement issue is a process issue, but it seems to me it's a longer term issue that's really going to require. These process issues, the ones that Supervisor McPherson and Pine have referenced, really go to the heart of our ability to implement effective change in this process. Okay? All right. Anything else, Supervisor Pine?
No.
I think this side is done for the moment. This side. Mr. Waldeck.
I want to pick up on your noise requirement that you asked for. Some time back, I got involved in looking at what our basic problem is, and I honestly think that the noise spec is clearly outdated. But one of the things it certainly does not do is take a look from a physiological standpoint, the effect of repetitive noise impacts, loud every 90 seconds, this kind of thing. It takes a look at a 24-hour average, but it doesn't take a look at the instantaneous impacts on the effect of people. And so I would amend our chair's suggestion of the noise spec to include a physiological impact assessment to any noise requirement and see what we can come up with. Right now, the effect on people just even isn't even considered other than some number. We need a better method. The other thing I want to bring to light here is that today, United Aircraft flies 154 Airbus 320 series airplanes into San Francisco. They have, over the year, about 1,100 to 1,200, I think it's over a month rather, such arrivals into San Francisco. And they announced today that they were going to install these vortex generators on all of their A320 series airplanes to help cut that noise. I was really rather grateful to hear the whistle that came on a little while ago. Unfortunately, I think it was our air conditioning, not necessarily the actual airplane. But it gives you an effect of what some of that sound was like. If you haven't heard it, it can be very loud. There's actually two little whistles that are created by the two vents on the wings. One at a little over 500 hertz, another one around 620. These are loud and they're long. And for the period of time where the wings are venting on their descent, bringing in more air from the outside to equalize the pressures, that is loud and is heard everywhere. So if we could come up with an AD or some sort of a directive on the part of the FAA for aircraft flying into the San Francisco Bay Area to have those requirement to put those vortex generators on, I think that'd be a long way towards solving this problem. That was my comment. Thank
Agreed.
you.
I think that issue was raised at the last meeting, but it can't hurt to underscore it. Okay. Anything else on this side of the column? Ms. Bernal?
Speaking of the Airbuses, when we were taking the public hearings, there were an awful lot of people that were talking about the oceanic flights coming in late at night and how loud they are, Korean Air, the Airbuses, a couple of Hawaiian flights. I know we're constrained in how much we can limit flights in and out, but I'm wondering if there is any way that the FAA can change the hours or request hours. I don't know. It was such a tremendous impact on me hearing how this was disrupting people's lives at night, especially. And I don't have an answer. I don't have a suggestion, but I think it's something that would be worthwhile because we certainly did hear a lot about it from a lot of residents. Thank you.
Thank you. Last call, and there's no need to fill the time till 4 o'clock today, folks. So just, just either for the public or for our committee. Anything else that fits into these categories? Any other process issues that are floating around out there? Because, if there are, I do think it's important for the public to understand the process. We've tried to manage the fact that we're designing this process as we go a little bit since it's a first-time effort, but I think we're clear about the fact that we have 2 committee meetings in August, September, October, and then 1 in November. Just a cautionary note, which is that if we're going to provide time for the public to comment, an opportunity for the public to comment on a proposed set of recommendations to Congress, that probably means that we have to release a document sometime between our first and second meeting in October, because you're going to want to provide an opportunity at the meeting in October for people to comment and then to be heard, and then for proposed revisions to be made as indicated by the committee, so that we have a final document for discussion and action at that single meeting in November. So while November 17th may sound like a long way off in terms of a set of recommendations, we're really looking at, I think, something in writing to share as a draft between the first and second meeting in October. So that means we've got to cover this ground, and I will try and be mindful of the fact that we need to start answering some of these questions and coming to conclusions about what we think and want to recommend before we add new ones to the list of things to chat about. Mr. May, anything else today?
Thank you, Mr. Chair and committee members, again for the opportunity to speak and clarify some of the challenges and struggles that we're all facing through this process.
All right. Somebody want to remind me when the next committee meeting is? The 18th, which is 2 weeks from today, in these same chambers from 1 to 4. Last call for members of the committee. Any outstanding issues? If not, without objection, the meeting stands adjourned. Thank you all very much.